obviously my focus is on First Nations, but in terms of the way in which we approach these court cases, we raised all of the arguments around economics, around alternatives, around the need for the project. We had, I think, a very solid report from the Joint Review Panel. I think that Site C is it's a bit of a microcosm of the way that this government does business, and it is one of the most opaque governments, I think, in history. In this case, they eliminated all oversight, all independent oversight. They eliminated the BC Utilities Commission, the Agricultural Land Commission. They enacted the Clean Energy Act, which basically stacked the deck, making Site C a fait accompli. They had this curious 93% requirement of energy that needed to be produced within BC. So we think they reverse engineered the project to come out, Site C being the winner. They have this program, this top secret program. I think I referred to it as HAL 9000. I think in another talk that I did, but I think it's called the System Optimizer. And so we think that they crunched a bunch of numbers in the System Optimizer, and it came out with Site C, and the sweet spot was 7.9 billion. So the environmental assessment certificates are granted. They say, well, it's in the public interest, or in the federal context, all of these environmental effects, which the Royal Society of Academics found it has the most unmitigable impacts, adverse impacts in the history of Canadian environmental assessment under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. And that's been in place, I think if you go back to what they called ERPGO, I think since the late 80s or thereabouts. But the federal government said, yep, it's justified in the circumstances, and of course we had Ministers Pollack and Thompson saying, yeah, it's in the public interest. Notwithstanding, we can't make out the need, we can't make out the cost. I can't remember. Basically, the Joint Review Panel rejected all of their core claims in terms of economics, and they said, go to the BC Utilities Commission and figure these things out. Well, they lied. They lied about the cost. 2 months later, the final investment decision is made. They haven't put a shovel in the ground. Suddenly it's 8.8 billion. What's the real cost? We don't know. They said, well, KPMG looked at it. KPMG produced a 5-page letter saying, well, your methodology is sound, your inputs, what you're putting in here is good, but nobody's ever looked at this project in terms of what the costs are. And as Dr. Swain said, it's you, the taxpayers, our kids, maybe our grandkids that are going to be paying for this white elephant. And this is only one project. We got LNG. We've got the Massey Tunnel replacement. They want to do this bridge. Again, no oversight. This is a government that's, their policy approach is a field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. That's the theory. So we've gone to court a few times, and we haven't done very well. And I think that the decisions to the courts, obviously it has an effect on First Nations and my clients directly and the other First Nations, but it also does violence to the environmental assessment process. When you have a panel that says, look, you've got all these problems, and the panel, Dr. Swain didn't go through this, but the panel was under a time crunch. They didn't really have a lot of resources to do the work that they had to do. And hydro, they snow you thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pages of drivel that you've got to go through. And they do this on the First Nations as well. And, they did a great job. They come up with a report and they say, we don't agree with your methodology. You got it wrong. The way in which you're dealing with impacts on treaty rights is completely false. Your cumulative effects methodology is a joke. They did a narrative. The baseline was 2012. It's like, well, those effects have already happened. So in terms of cumulative effects, we're going to start at 2012 and we'll work our way forward. And those aren't significant. So what did the government do with the report? Nothing. They didn't send it to the BCUC. They didn't go back for further environmental assessment and say, do a proper cumulative effects assessment. They didn't do any of those things. I got a list, the effects that can't be mitigated: fish, plants, birds, First Nations exercise of rights, Dr. Sayers references. We all know dams kill fish. Dams poison fish. Methylmercury. The First Nations up here have been dealing with methylmercury since the W.A.C. Bennett Dam. 50 years. Massive infringement. They were never consulted. They've never even been offered a dime from BC Hydro. We had the Peace Canyon Dam. The First Nations put in evidence. They said, look, we can't fish. We can't fish in any of these tributaries anymore. And now you're going to put a third dam in, take up 85% of the Peace River in BC, and you're going to infringe on our treaty right. We have a treaty right to fish. It was never addressed. And as Dr. Sayers said, the Peace River block, has been and continues to be pounded by oil and gas, mining, roads, 3 hydro dams now, wind farms, roads. And the First Nations are still waiting for this cumulative effects assessment. BC has finally said, well, they're still working on terms of reference now for what they call an RC, a Regional Strategic Environmental Assessment. One of the things that the panel recommended they do before they approved this project. So, by the time this thing's done, that ship may have sailed. Well, where's this oil and gas going to come from if we get LNG? Well, it's going to come from Northeast BC. It's not coming from Alberta. So there you go. There's even more cumulative effects that come from that. So I just wanted to talk about the federal government, our feckless federal government. And I'm talking about the Trudeau government in this case, and we think they failed to uphold the honor of the Crown. So the decision to approve the project was Harper's, the Harper government. So no surprise there. But when the Trudeau government came in, we had hope, given their promises, and they had opportunities. They had ample opportunities. The First Nations. We met with the ministers. We went out in December to Ottawa and crashed the Liberals' Christmas party and gave the ministers all kinds of briefing materials and the like, and met with Minister LeBlanc, who is the Minister of Fisheries, met with Minister McKenna, and said, look, you got to take another look at this order in council. And they said, no, we're just going to look forward. And they issued these permits. The fisheries permits. This was in the news back in the summer. Fisheries permits, navigable waters permits to allow the dam. And it's, rather than supporting the First Nations treaty rights, Canada repeated the same mistakes they made with WAC Bennett and Peace Canyon. They acquiesced. They just sat on the sideline and said, well, it's not really our problem. And it's crazy. You think about what happened in the United States. Contrast the situation that's been going on in Washington State for the last 45 years. It's been the federal government that's been taking the state of Washington to court repeatedly. Now with Trump, I don't think it's likely it's going to happen anytime soon. But to protect the tribes' right to the fish. Going back to the 70s, it's U.S. versus state of Washington. Protecting the tribes' rights to fish. In this case, Canada just rolled over and said, okay, what Christie wants, Christie gets. So what now? I think reconciliation, as Dr. Sayers said, is a distant goal, right? The courts have effectively given the Crown carte blanche. When you read the judgments, they're on the internet. They say basically, as long as they provide a process. So if the First Nations, well, look, you got to comment on the terms of reference. You got to comment, on the Crown consultation report. You got to comment on all of these great things. So what's your complaint? Well, you didn't change the project at all. Like the height of the dam didn't go down a centimeter. The length of the dam. They say, oh, look at all these modifications we did. You didn't do anything. You didn't look at alternatives. You didn't really do anything. And particularly in this case, none of the conditions or the accommodations really address the substance of the First Nations complaint. And BC Court of Appeal, we were hopeful when we went there. We had the Enbridge decision, the Gailus decision, which we said was on all fours, joint review panel report. And the Court of Appeal spent one paragraph on it. Oh, this is totally different. It's like, no, it's not. So, why bother with an EA process? Why bother with consultation? If the government can just simply run roughshod over their environmental assessment process and over First Nations rights. If the Crown doesn't have a positive obligation to ensure their treaty promises are fulfilled, they can just simply run roughshod over First Nations. And so, I think when you read the cases, essentially the underlying thing is First Nations must give way to the government regardless, of the project. The Crown doesn't have any burden to show they need the project. It's just, they say, well, it's in the public interest. And the courts go, well, we're not going to go there. We're going to give these elected officials deference, assuming that they actually are acting in the public interest as opposed to, some legacy project to try and get reelected because they haven't actually produced any of the things they said they were going to do. So I think I'll end it there.
Where the public is on this, both geographically, where's the support for this in the public? Both geographically and demographically, and why? What's why?
Me?
Why not?
Well, at $9 billion, you're looking at 20 fast ferries fiascos. I'm not an economist.
That's 80 ferries.
That's like 80 ferries. But I made the reference to the field of dreams, and I think that that's superficially attractive, right? When government says, well, we're going to need that power someday, so why don't we build the dam now? We did WAC Bennett back in '67, and look at what a great legacy that provided for us. And because it's funny, I travel around, and sometimes cabbies ask me questions, and they go, well, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, well, I was just in court and challenging Site C Dam, and he's like, yeah, you're going to lose. We need that power. I'm like, well, you know what? We got a surplus, a huge surplus. Mm-hmm. People don't know this. People think, oh my goodness, well, our rates are going up. They're going to go up 40% over the next 5 years. But we got this massive surplus. And, I think I took economics 1 class in university, but that doesn't seem to make sense to me. The laws of supply and demand dictating price. But perhaps Dr. Swain can explain that to me.
Anybody here ever tried to explain anything to a lawyer? You ask an interesting question. Where are the folks on this stuff? And part of the problem, I think, is that we together, the 4.5 million of us in BC, are not very good at arithmetic. We're not interested in it. We don't pay attention to it. We go to sleep. These are big numbers, and who can tell a billion from a million, and la la la. Let me very quickly give you another story that is related to this. Every utility in Canada operates under Canadian generally accepted accounting principles, Canadian GAAP, right? The government of British Columbia has a law in its Financial Administration Act that says that all entities of the government of British Columbia, including departments and commissions and crown corporations and so on, will keep their books according to Canadian GAAP, except, if inconvenient, when a few years ago, when there was a change in the basic accounting standard, the International Financial Standard came in, boy, there's an eye glazer for you. It meant that companies had to account for things like pension liabilities as they occurred. So if you've got your employee's pension sitting over here and the market goes down, you're supposed to account for that as an obligation of the company. It goes onto your costs, it lowers your profits, and so on, right? This was inconvenient for BC Hydro and for its owner, because in the 2008 year, the value of their pension fund dropped by $200 million, and this would have to be recorded as a loss, and it would reduce the rather notional profit that Hydro made, and therefore the dividend that Victoria could claim. The dividend is important to a Minister of Finance who wants to claim that he's financially prudent. All right, so what do you do in such a circumstance? Well, the easy thing is change the accounting standard. So suddenly there was a midnight order in council that said that BC Hydro, alone among all other, will do its accounting according to an American standard called FASB 980, which is fairly generous on the issue of deferral accounts. A deferral account is set up by a corporation when it's got, let's say, very lumpy capital expenditures and a steady stream of income, and it doesn't want, as in the case of utility, to face its customers with a big increase one year and a decrease the next year, and so on and so forth. People seem to be happier when their rates are steady. So deferral accounts are normal in the utility business. They usually never amount to more than 6 or 7% of the equity of the company, which in our case would be $200 million. BC Hydro has now run up deferral accounts over $5 billion. All right? This is, let me give you an example of a deferral account. They have income which they can pretty accurately forecast because the rates have been approved by the Utilities Commission for the next couple of years, right? So that income can be, if you want, it can be accounted for now. Prudently, you would account for it only when you get it. In the out years, let's say from 2019 onward, Hydro says it needs a 14% increase in rates or whatever the number is, and that's the number, and we know that the government isn't going to stand for it. But they nonetheless put that sum in a deferral account, say that it's money that's owed to them by us or our kids. It's therefore income in the present year. It counts as part of the notional profit of BC Hydro, on which or from which water rentals and dividends are paid. Now, how'd they get there? The American standard allows these deferral accounts to be set up only if the amounts are approved by an independent third-party regulator. Aha. So guess what? A little later, there's another midnight order in council that says that BC Hydro will now operate according to the proscribed standard, which is FASB 980, with no mention of a regulator. They can make it up. They don't have to have a regulator look at it. Now, all that's assuming that you think that BCUC is in fact an independent regulator at this point, subject as it is to orders, directions, and whatnot, whenever convenient.
I think there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of communities are trying to become independent of the grid. You know, whether it's through solar or a wind turbine, geothermal, even putting something in like your ground source heat pump, zero emission homes. Like there's just so many things that we can do to reduce our use of power. And, you know, and BC Hydro calls it
They call that demand side management.
Yeah, energy smart or whatever they call it. You know, just how to reduce power in our homes, and we can do that.
I'd like to get your reactions on, do the opposition parties understand this issue? Have they taken clear positions, or are they subject to the same difficulties? Because what do we do?
As I understand it, John Horgan has been not definitive, and if anybody knows better, you can let me know. I think he was waiting to see how far along the project got by the time of the election and how much money had been spent to date. So I think he was a bit ambivalent. I think he wanted to, but he was not coming out strongly. And I believe the Greens are against Site C and will do everything they can to reverse what's happened up there. That's my feeling. I don't know if John knows any better.
I mean, I know that Adrian Dix is pretty well informed on this, particularly on the economic side of things, and tracking what's coming out in the BC Utilities Commission. So, you know, even though the approval of the project didn't go through BCUC, you know, all the subsequent decisions, sort of on the economic side, have had to go through the Utilities Commission. So a lot of evidence has come out in terms of, you know, the government bearing a lot of this information.
Thank you very much.